The same was said about Tony Blair 20 years ago, that he wanted to be president of Europe. I mean, Macron, whose egos knows no bound, I'm absolutely sure that's what he's got his heart on.
Okay, Gavin, thank you so much for joining us. You wrote a piece recently in The Spectator about TikToks and how the Home Office are trying to deter illegal migrants from coming to Britain. Do you think this new strategy of the Home Office, by posting these TikToks, is going to work?
No, it won't work. It will go the same way as every other initiative since the beginning of a century, really, whether it's the under the Blair government and then the Tories. There is no way to stop the boats or smash the gangs other than to do what the Australians did, which is to push the boats back. But no British government has the courage to do that.
When it comes to these strategies, I mean, Labour say that they've deported 50,000 people, or 50,000 people have left Britain since Labour came into power. Do you think Labour are handling it better than the Tories were when they were in office?
No, not really. The one in, one out deal, as I said, I think 195 genuine asylum seekers vetted by the French have arrived since the deal was concluded in the summer, and 193 have gone the other way to France. So that's an indication of the utter failure of that scheme. The figures now, you see a slight change in the mood music this year. Newspapers running articles saying that net migration is down, etc. But if you dig down a little bit, that's mainly younger British people who are leaving, and EU nationals who are returning home. But the numbers of people coming from Africa illegally or legally, or Southeast Asia and the Middle East legally. Of course, it's the legal migration under Boris Johnson, the Boris wave, which has done the real damage. And this government shows no. I think more than anything, Stephen, it's just the lack of determination. It's just endless sound bites. It's quite similar to France. I'm talking to you from France, and Macron, who came to power in spring 2017, in one of his first speeches at the Sorbonne University in September 2017, said that immigration, asylum seekers was one of the issues that he really wanted to tackle, and that he would, etc., etc. In 2024, France experienced record numbers of illegal and legal immigration. So France and Britain are both on a race to the bottom.
When it comes to tackling the illegal migration, a lot of people say, you need to leave the European Court of Human Rights, you need to repeal the Human Rights Act. Do you think Labour are too wedded to the sort of system of human rights, the system of international law, to ever even consider doing that?
Yes, I do. I think they are. It's interesting. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago for The Spectator, really elaborating on what we've just talked about. The successive governments who failed to grasp the issue of illegal immigration. And in 2001, 2002, the Home Affairs Committee reported that perhaps one of the initiatives that they had to embrace was leaving the 1951 refugee convention, which it said was no longer relevant to the modern world. So in fact, I think, if anything, the left has retreated on the issue of illegal immigration, by which I mean it's got weaker, it's more frightened to tackle it, and it's now just the left across, with the exception of the Danish government, across Europe. I think the left wing is so entrenched in the idea of free movement that I see absolutely no genuine will and determination to tackle this issue. And with the human rights industry, it's a cliche, but it's true. And of course, the left-wing newspapers at the moment, any government or any Home Secretary does say anything slightly bold, they will immediately be attacked, and social media. And there's just the cowardice, the moral cowardice, I think, and the intellectual dishonesty is the two characteristics that have come to define the British government's approach this century.
You talk about morality. There's two ways to look at this from a moral perspective. There's the kind of left-wing perspective, which is these are people fleeing from war, from poverty, from chaos. We have a responsibility as a wealthy nation to look after the world's poor and to look after those people who are fleeing from their home countries, who would face persecution in Syria, Eritrea, Sudan, wherever they're from. And then there's the kind of other perspective, which is that illegal migrants have been raping and murdering numerous British people. You see lots of stories in the news about this. Almost every day it feels like there's a new case of where an illegal migrant commits a terrible crime against a British person. Do you think that the left, I mean this Labour government, do you think it understands that compassion when it comes to the native British people? I mean, when they see these stories, how do they interpret that in their worldview? How do they look at these? Do they see it like an isolated case, or how do you think that they even process that?
Firstly, just one of the more interesting stats of immigration stats: 26,000 migrants were intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard last year and turned back to North Africa. 26,000. 23,500 were men. So the vast majority are economic migrants. We see that in the pictures and the photos of the people coming across the channel in small boats. The overwhelming majority are young men. Now, you mentioned about the rape and the murder. There have been a very few small incidents. I think more than anything, it's the pressure on housing, on just the social fabric, the infrastructure, and particularly the Islamization of Europe. That's a word that the French use the whole time, that the numbers coming from predominantly Islamic cultures who have wildly different views about homosexuality, about women, about Jews. I think that's one of the gravest aspects of mass immigration this century, the way it has just changed society for the worse that way. And to answer your question, Stephen, no, I think the left have no compassion for the indigenous population, which incidentally includes British people of any colour, but they seem to be more interested about people from Africa, the Middle East, and of course the Danish immigration minister in 2023, who I quote in the article that you referenced at the top of this interview, he said, "I am 200% left wing, and it is incumbent on any left wing government to tackle illegal immigration, because who suffers most? It's not the rich, it's not the bourgeois, it's the working class." And this just seems to have escaped the British and the French left.
Let's talk about France then. So what's the French view of the illegal migration crisis into Britain, so the small boats? I know that the French government recently banned, I think, 8 Britons who are going around trying to destroy some of these rubber dinghies and so on the beaches. What's the kind of French public's view of this stuff and the French government's view?
Well, firstly, it gets very, very little coverage in the French press, what's going on at the Channel. The general view is better that they're in Britain than they are in France. There's been lots of trouble. And of course, the poor people of Calais, I mean, this has been going on, even with the greatest of respect, Stephen, since before you were born, the Sandgate Club, the jungle of the late 20th century. And they're utterly fed up with it. The French press, certainly the printed press, which tends to be very left-wing, doesn't cover it, or if it does, it's sob stories really about the conditions that the illegal migrants are living in. The French government, frankly, the French government is in such a mess, and has been for nearly 2 years since Macron called the snap election in June 2024. It's still trying to push through a budget for this year after about 5 months of tortured negotiations. So they really don't care about it, and they can expect no help. Well, the British can expect no help whatsoever from the French. And a point I would like to make, if I may, Stephen, is that there was this idea mooted towards the end of last year about the French police perhaps puncturing the boats in shallow water to prevent them being launched. And the police union says, no, no way, we're not doing that. And I quite understand that, because the French police now increasingly are being taken to court by human rights lawyers. They have not much support from the government. You may remember the riots of the summer of 2023, when a policeman shot a 17-year-old French Algerian in a stolen car who was speeding away from a checkpoint. He's now being prosecuted for murder. So the French police just do not want to get involved, and one can understand why.
So Macron called this snap election. Obviously, it backfired on him. What's the situation now in France? Is it just political chaos?
It is political chaos, and this week the appeal has started for Marine Le Pen's appeal against her conviction last year for misusing EU funds, diverting about 4 million euros of money from the EU, not for personal enrichment, but to pay her own party members. This is because for many years it was impossible for in effect, a bit like Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen's party was debanked, so it was impossible to get any loans from banks. They refused to touch her. And so she was disqualified for 5 years, which eliminates her from next year's presidential election. She's appealed this, but her understudy, Jordan Bardella, who's 30 years old and in some ways is seen as a better candidate. He's more right-wing. Left-wing, Le Pen is very left-wing economically, also a little bit soft on Islamism. Jordan Bardella, I think, is more conservative, more economically liberal, and appeals to the middle classes. So they're really the one party that hasn't suffered neither from the conviction of Marine Le Pen or the political chaos that has characterised France in the last 2 years. A poll released this beginning of this week had Le Pen and Bardella on a 38% approval rating, way out in front of anyone else. The current Prime Minister Le Cornu was on 25%, Macron was on 15%, which is an indication of just how despised he is. And that's a great tragedy of France, really, that a man who came to power in 2017 with so much hope invested in him, that he was, as he promised, neither left nor right, but a break from the past, a break from the failing past of 40 years, has just actually been, he's deepened the sense of despair, the sense of alienation. And I can see no way that any centrist is going to win the election next year. I think increasingly it looks as though it will be a showdown between Le Pen's party, either her or Bardella, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the French Jeremy Corbyn.
You talk about Macron's approval ratings being very rock bottom. Obviously, Starmer suffers from similar approval ratings. How has Macron reacted to the election of Starmer? Do you view the two figures as having those similarities? I know that Macron's been there for a lot longer. Are they both in the same kind of quagmire politically?
Absolutely. It's one of the great contricks of Emmanuel Macron, which was he got away with it because of as I said, the majority of the media in France is left-leaning, sort of centre-left. And that is very much Macron. He portrayed himself. He set up this party, République En Marche, and he said he was a centrist, but he joined the Socialist Party as a young man. He served as the finance minister in François Hollande's socialist government. He is a socialist, just as Keir Starmer is. So really, Keir Starmer is Macron's favourite prime minister. He absolutely loathed Boris Johnson, which I think many Brits can understand. He didn't really understand Rishi Sunak, although he was a banker. I mean, obviously Macron is what we call a champagne socialist, what the French call a gauche caviar, so a caviar socialist. But he's very much of that sort of centre-left progressive ideology, dogma that defines Starmer. He's culturally, Macron is the most left-wing president of the Fifth Republic. He's more left-wing in that sense than François Hollande, who is more of an old-school socialist. So I think the two of them are, and Starmer has talked, and I think he first visited Macron in 2023, if my memory serves me correctly, and he since described him as a friend. And I think it's that genuinely does regard Macron as a friend, and they're certainly both as incompetent as each other.
So we know that Starmer has had lots of issues over the last year that have led to his demise in the opinion polls. So obviously immigration, struggling with the economy, tax rises, broken promises, lots of U-turns. Every week seems to be another crisis, incompetence in government, the sacking of Sue Gray. It just seems like a complete mess. What's going on in France? Why is Macron struggling so much? Again, are there similarities? What kind of issues are French people angry about, concerned about?
Very similar, really. The parallels between the two countries are great. Let's talk about the economy first. Macron, when he came to power, was self-styled as the Mozart of finance, I quote. He's ruined the French economy. Public debt to GDP has risen from 98% to 120% in his 9 years in office. What the French call the purchasing power, that's also stagnated. Everything is more expensive in the shops. And that, of course, has infuriated the middle classes in particular, because they voted for Macron in the belief that he said, we're going to become a start-up nation, we're going to modernise the economy. And of course, one thing he did do, I suppose his flagship policy was the raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, but that's since been reversed in order to keep the government afloat. So he's backed down on that. He's as weak in that regard as Keir Starmer, but very similar to Keir Starmer, it's really immigration and insecurity which are the issues that have most angered the French public. What are known as the OQTFs, the obligations to quit the territory français, the deportation orders. In 2019, Macron made a promise that within 2 years they would be 100% executed, these orders. So anyone who was in the country illegally and had committed a wrongdoing would be expelled. It's 7% in the 7 years since, and there have been some truly horrific crimes committed by people against French citizens. One of the most notorious was 3 years ago, the rape and murder of Lola, a 12-year-old Parisian, by an Algerian woman who was under one of his deportation orders. And just last week, Stephen, allegedly a 15-year-old girl who was raped by an Algerian who again was under one of his deportation orders. And it's just the fact that Macron never says anything about it. It's as if he doesn't care. Similarly with immigration, as I talked about earlier, he promised to get a grip on that and it's just got worse. And like Starmer, there's this real sense that he's simply gaslighting the French public, that he comes in front of a camera, he says with sincerity in his eyes, don't worry, things are getting better. And the French look around them and see a country in absolute ruins.
There's this idea that on the continent, countries are much more willing to break international treaties if it suits them. And even the European Union have been, making different noises about deportations in Greece and other places recently. Why is it that France and Macron hasn't been able to grip the issue of illegal migration? Why can't he do these deportations? Is he too wedded to the international treaties, to international law, to human rights legislation, as Starmer is? What's going on?
Very good question. I think there's 2 points. Firstly, yes, he is an absolutely committed Europhile, and I think he's got his eyes on replacing Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President when he steps down next year. I think there's going to be very few jobs going for him domestically, so despised is he. So I think that's part of it. But I also think that really the French left have been marching through the institutions since a good 20 years before Britain, even 30 years. I suppose a lot of people date the left's takeover of Britain's institutions to the arrival of Tony Blair. Really, in France, it began with the '68 May protests, which was very much this sort of bourgeois socialism. They then came to political power in 1981 with Francois Mitterrand, and ever since the centre-left socialists have got their claws into every institution. So, for example, the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, which is appointed by the president, and it's a 9-year fixed term. It was up until beginning of last year, Laurent Fabius, who was the socialist prime minister in the 1980s, and then Macron replaced him with Richard Ferrand, who's one of his closest socialist allies. The State Council is run by socialists. The National Audit Office is run by a member of a socialist party. So everywhere you look, socialists are in power. And this, of course, has been said about Britain and the blob, that in a way, the elected, it doesn't matter who's elected as a politician or even as a prime minister. It's the civil service, the fonctionnaires, as they're known in France, who run the country. And that's very true. And I think it's all very well about saying that, well, things may change if Marine Le Pen's party come to power. But there's going to be a hell of a battle with to change the constitution. And Bruno Retailleau, who's leader of the centre-right Republican Party, I suppose like the Tories, he recognises this and said that this is what's got to start, because he wants a referendum on immigration, for example. He was Home Secretary last year, but the Constitutional Court said, no, we're not having one. So the power invested in politicians in France is really quite limited, and there will need to be fundamental changes. But of course, the centre-left socialists, having been in power for half a century, will not give up lightly. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and very better fight in the next few years. And hopefully it will be a peaceful fight, because of course the other element, a very important difference between Britain and France, is that there's a very, very violent fringe of the extreme left in France. Working class, unlike the British working class, the British left-wing activists, who tend to be very bourgeois. You just have to look at their names when they're up in court for throwing tins of tomato ketchup at Van Goghs, etc. There is an element of an extremely violent working class French left, and it will be, and we see them obviously rioting during May Day protests and other demonstrations. If Le Pen's party do come to power next year, it will be very interesting to see what happens on the street.
I want to get into all of that, but first, you mentioned something fascinating about Macron. Is there any possibility that he will become the next president of the European Union?
Oh, I think he would love to do it, and this is what the French press believe, that this is what he wants, his dream job. And in a way, of course, the same was said about Tony Blair 20 years ago, that he wanted to be president of Europe. I mean, Macron, whose egos knows no bound, I'm absolutely sure that's what he's got his heart on. And of course, but he's in a slightly difficult position at the moment, because we're talking on the Friday. Tomorrow, the Saturday, the 17th of January, Ursula von der Leyen will be in Paraguay to sign this Mercosur trade deal with South America, which has been 25 years in the making, and the French are bitterly opposed to it. It's one of the few cases where the French are actually agreed across the political spectrum that it will be disastrous for French farmers, because Europe will be flooded with cheap agricultural produce. It will be very good, on the other hand, for German industry, particularly the car industry. And Macron has come out against this and said that France are opposed to this deal. Frankly, so what? They're in the minority, so the deal will go ahead. But what happens next? The French farmers, about 700 tractors, are going to be protesting outside the EU Parliament in Strasbourg next week. Some councils have said that they will be refusing any South American food. So it's going to be this could damage Macron's credentials. It puts him in a bit of a bind. Does he stand up for France, or does he tell the French it's for the greater good of Europe? I think he'll pay lip service to the anger of the French, but behind closed doors he'll be very much for it, because he doesn't want anything to derail his ambitions of becoming the EU Commission President.
Okay, so next year we have the presidential elections, and you've already talked about Bardella, about Le Pen, Mélenchon on the left. Let's say that Le Pen or Bardella, or the right wins those elections. What kind of challenges do they face? And do you think that Le Pen and Bardella have the competency to deal with these challenges?
Yeah, that's the question of people are asking, particularly of Bardella. He's 30 years old. He did go to university to read geography, but left after about a year to concentrate fully on his political career. He was identified at a young age as a rising star. What I'm trying to say is that he's got very little life experience, and this is often used against him, his youth. However, it is worth noting that when Mamdani was elected mayor of New York, who's just 4 years older than Bardella and has got more life experience but less political experience, the left in particular were hailing it as wonderful and a breath of fresh air, etc. So there's a slight double standards. But nonetheless, Bardella, he is bland. I think even his greatest supporters would not argue with that. But he does have this strange appeal among the under 30s, the TikTok generation. He's very good. He and his team at exploiting TikTok and social media. And he's very well presented. He's been compared to a young Jacques Chirac in how he dresses. So quite dark blue suits, somber ties, quite a slick haircut. And I think that's the image he's trying to cultivate. He's very much trying to appeal not just to the young, but also to the over 50s, to the bourgeois. He is more, as I said earlier, he's more economically liberal. And of course, he doesn't have the Le Pen surname. And I can't stress enough how significant that is, Stephen, because there is, particularly for over 60s middle class people, just the name Le Pen makes them shudder because of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of what was the National Front in 1972, Marine Le Pen's father. And that was a genuinely far-right party. And two of the founding members, one had fought for the French division of the Waffen SS during the Second World War, a full Nazi. And Le Pen was often in court for making anti-Semitic statements, which one has to say, judged in current climates by some of what the left say in Europe, were fairly mild. But nonetheless, he left the reputation of a thug, and for the over 60s, they haven't forgotten that, which is why, as I said earlier, I think it wouldn't be too disastrous if Le Pen didn't win her appeal and was disqualified, because I don't think Bardella, he's certainly not, I don't think they'd lose much in the way of clout at the polls. It may even do them a little bit of good. But I think that the main issues they'll be doing, I said earlier, it's going to be taking on the constitution, taking on the blob, because it's it's part of the constitution, really. This whole liberty, equality, fraternity, written into the French constitution about looking after the oppressed, which includes migrants and asylum seekers, and just even tinkering with those rules is going to be a huge process. They will, of course, also need to win an absolute majority in Parliament. So there are 577 seats in the National Assembly. If they win over half, then they control the House. This was the start of the end for Macron in the 2022 presidential election. He beat Marine Le Pen, but then in the parliamentary elections a month later, his party lost their absolute majority. And if you lose your absolute majority, it really weakens your power to pass legislation. So I think the general consensus seems to be in France that there has been a lot of talk recently about a union of the right, a coalition with the centre-right Republicans and Eric Zemmour's Conquest Party. I think that won't happen for the presidential election because Le Pen and Bardella believe that they have enough support to win that election. Where they may need to have a union is the parliamentary elections, and to come together with the centre-right Republicans and other parties on the issues of immigration and insecurity to secure an absolute majority. And then they can dish out jobs, cabinet jobs to the various parties. And then they can really pass legislation and look at changing the constitution in order to pass the bills that they want to.
All right, Gavin, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.